It must be a testament to the quality of Neon Genesis Evangelion that I've spent a grossly disproportionate amount of time thinking about and talking about this series in comparison to how much time I've actually spent watching it. I am friends with a lot of Evangelion fans, and I've seen a lot of them online. You've got guys like Endless Jess, who seems to understand more nuance in the story than most, and is able to capture it very beautifully when he talks about the series, who has actually been racked with the fact that he's seen it so much and thinks about it so much that he finds it difficult to actually talk about because he's afraid of not saying enough. Then you've got guys like Goat Jesus or Pseudo Steph who have talked about the show continuously and will just write video after video about it. You've got guys like Demolition D who have covered it fairly extensively. All of these people, I know they watch Evangelion a lot. They watch it regularly. And the funny thing about me is that I'm also known for saying a lot of deep shit about Evangelion. People really appreciated the episodic analysis that I was doing for a little while, which was never intended to go all the way through the show. Each of those was an individual video. They were not intended to be part of a series at all. It just so happened that I ended up covering more of it than I first anticipated. And I bring up the show all the time, but the funny part about it is I've seen Evangelion all the way through twice. The first time was in 2006, and the second time was in 2015. Aside from that, I've had a very strange, complex relationship with the show, in that what I get out of it, what I think about it, and my impressions of it continually change almost every time that I look back on it, which has kept it deeply fascinating to me. But again, it's not a show that I rewatch all the time or anything. I mean, there is no show that I do that for. I've said this before in one of these previous podcasts that for the longest time, I didn't really have the kind of favorite anime that I think a lot of people do, a show that they revisit all the time, that they think about all the time. Like, the anime I've seen the most times is Fooly Cooly, which I've seen so many times because it's so short and because they would run it on Adult Swim, so I saw it a bunch of times on there, a few times on my own recorded VHS, and then a few times when I was writing about it back in 2009. The last time I watched it was 2011, so even that, I haven't watched it in the last 5 years. I've seen K-On! All the way through twice, I think. I'm not someone who rewatches a lot of shows because I'm constantly trying to view new things. I usually return to a series only when I find an excuse, even if that excuse is just showing it to a new friend or something, but that happens so rarely that it's not exactly something I get to do all the time. So if you've ever had a perception of me as like a diehard Evangelion guy, I definitely am not in the way that other people are. But that hasn't stopped it from at various times being my favorite anime, or being one that I cared about deeply or talked a lot about. It just has a way of worming into the consciousness. There's just so much to the show. And I really think that more than anything is what's carried it for these last 20 years. What's made it a show that people won't stop talking about is that there's just so much in it. Now, if it wasn't enough of a mind blow that I only watched the show once in the course of the 10 years before I started talking about it, and even then, those videos I was writing, I was watching them as I rewatched the show. I did not rewatch the entire thing and then go back through to start making videos. I was just rewatching it and writing videos as they came to mind, though I have seen those first 9 episodes more than the rest of the show. But if that's not enough, the day that I did watch it, it was something like late July in 2006, and I watched it in one day, dubbed with my brother Victor. We marathoned the entire show. I know he passed out in the last few episodes, but those are the ones that made it my favorite. So let me paint a picture of who I was circa 2006. I was 14, about to turn 15, shortly after watching the show. So I was the age of Shinji, Asuka, and Rei. And I could not have watched the show at a more perfect time. Now, you'll hear a lot of people say that you can connect with Evangelion better if you watch it when you're 14. I don't know if this is necessarily true. I think you'll just connect to it differently. If you watch the show when you're 14, you'll probably connect to one of the main characters. I connected to Shinji, as most people do. Some people connect to Asuka, such as Endless Jess, who's always said that he saw himself in Asuka and not Shinji at all. And I have known older fans who struggled to get into the show because they couldn't connect with Shinji, because it seemed so young to them, until they realized that they could connect with Misato, who is like 29 in the series and has a lot of highly relatable problems to adults. And indeed, for myself, my main person I connect with has shifted over the years from Shinji to Misato. And I feel lucky that I got to have sort of both experiences, that I got to be Shinji at one point and Misato at another. But, if you're older and you want to watch Evangelion, you haven't seen it yet, just look at Shinji as a kid. I think it's very important that you do so, that you look at the characters in Eva for what age they are, because a lot of anime doesn't really ask that of you. Most anime is about high schoolers, but it treats the characters as just sort of non-human entities. Like, they're not quite adults, they're not quite kids, they can be whatever they need to be to fit the scenario. Most of them are out fighting monsters and shit just because they can, but in this case, Shinji has to fight monsters, but you have to think of him as a 14-year-old boy, and you have to think of him as a character who has these psychological problems. You're not supposed to relate to him if you are not him. If you want to relate to a character, you should look to the older ones if you happen to be older, because they will probably be closer to the way you feel about the scenario. I mean, if you start off kind of aggravated with Shinji, look at Misato, who gets very aggravated with Shinji at the beginning of the show because she doesn't know how to communicate with him and has a difficulty with explaining to him why he's needed, and sort of, she feels empathy for him, but she doesn't know how to connect with him on a personal level until episode 4. So, look at it that way. Now, for me, though, I was totally Shinji Ikari, like in ways that were almost disturbingly parallel. Now, I've often read into Evangelion that I think Shinji sort of has some sort of Asperger's and just a general inability to understand other people and to communicate properly. And I also think that I had something of that sort when I was that age. I did not understand other people at all. Nothing was more confusing to me in the world than everybody who wasn't me, and even a lot of myself. I had just gone through a major bout of depression. I mean, I was still in it, but I was sort of on my way to greener pastures. I mean, it's still dark. I was depressed for a very long time. But the worst of it was at a time where my family had moved to a new house and I had no friends whatsoever at school because I was the only white kid at the entire school and nobody would talk to me. And aside from being white, I was also like a weirdo with long hair and a shitty beard, and I wore sweatpants all the time. So, I was avoided by and large at school. And the only friends I had were on the internet, and I would connect with this incredibly shitty connection. So it took 5 minutes for a page to load. So I'd sit there and have these incredibly slow conversations with people through private messages and stuff. And I was so desperate and so lonely that anyone who wanted to form any connection with me, I would just rush headlong into it, only to immediately realize that I am terrified of making connections and then run away. So there was a few times where, let's say, some other lonely soul would say they were in love with me. And I would be like, all right, well, we're gonna have a relationship. And it would go for a couple of days back and forth. And then I'd get really freaked out thinking about how this is wrong and it's not gonna go right. And then I would be the biggest asshole in the world in the process of breaking it off. One of those cases was with another guy. There was a guy who I at one point was questioning my sexuality. I posted on the message board something about thinking I was bisexual. And this guy, who was a couple years older than me, reached out and was like, hey, I really like you based on your posts and I wanna try a relationship. And I was like, sure. Now, where this quickly got weird is that this dude would call me on the phone at my house to talk to me. And first of all, he had a really nerdy voice, so I immediately had the illusion of attractiveness completely shattered. And second of all, it was weird for me because I'd be playing video games with my brother or something, and then someone's calling my house phone. I'm like, okay, this is fucking weird. So I broke off with him, and I did it in a total asshole dick way, as I always did. I don't think that I was ever anywhere close to bisexual. I think I was so fucking desperate for any human connection, so desperate to talk to whoever would look my way, that I was willing to just take all comers. And that, to me, is exactly who Shinji Ikari is. Shinji is surrounded by these beautiful girls who he clearly is attracted to, but doesn't know how to talk to. And doesn't even understand his own emotions towards them. I don't think Shinji even thinks about the fact that, that there's a possibility that he could maybe hook up with Rei or Asuka. Like, that never occurs to him. They're just these beautiful girls who are sort of around him. And, he thinks about them. He tries to kiss Asuka at one point. He masturbates over her fucking hospital bed in the movie. But he never even thinks about, like, just saying, I like you or something. They're just these kind of aliens to him. He doesn't know how to form a connection with any of these people. The only one who he ends up having any connection with is Misato, and that's because after, a period of her being frustrated, she sort of gets him in episode 4. She, like, starts to understand that he does want connection. Like, at first, I think that Misato sees Shinji as pushing everyone away, and he just doesn't want to be bothered, But then once she realizes that he actually is crying for help, that he does need a shoulder to lean on, then she's kind of, willing to be that for him. But then, of course, as the series goes on, everyone else gets so fucked that none of them can really spare time for Shinji. Things start going wrong for everybody. At some point, Asuka's been mind-fucked, Rei's dead, Misato loses Kaji and loses her fucking shit. Nobody has time to put up with Shinji, who still hasn't figured out what the fuck, how to connect with people, And so, for me, watching Evangelion that first day with my brother, I mean, most of the show was entertaining and interesting. But, like, I didn't connect that strongly with, like, episode 4, for instance. I thought it was kind of boring the first time I watched it. I liked that there was all these angel battles, these big violent moments, these awesome scenes, these fun moments in the midsection of the show. I totally didn't get Asuka at all. I didn't get Rei at all. I didn't get Misato at all. The only character I connected with was Shinji. All the other ones I just didn't get because, again, my problems were the same as Shinji's. I didn't connect with people. I didn't understand people. And Evangelion's not a show that holds your hand through that. If you are someone who can understand other people, then you can get into the heads of these characters. But if you're not, then you will be in the same position Shinji is. Who the hell are these people? I don't get it. I don't get why Asuka treats me this way. I don't get why Rei is at all like she is. I don't get Misato. That's how I felt. I was completely in his shoes. So the show's going along, and I'm enjoying it. All the twists and turns and the big crazy moments when fucking he has to kill, potentially kill his best friend, when he has to eat the angel as the Eva. Like, all that stuff is fucking awesome. But it was the last 3 episodes where Eva really, like, became something that hit me on a deep level. And the first part is because of Kaoru. Because in this state where everyone's kind of left Shinji behind, because they've all, they're all dealing with their own traumas, and Shinji's kind of alone, and along comes Kaoru, a boy who is very intimate with Shinji and is just willing to accept him for what he is, and just immediately reaches out to him in a way that nobody else would have. Kaoru comes along and is just like, Shinji, I'm here for you. I'm just here for you. And so Shinji falls for him. And that was I was like, that's exactly what happened to me. Like, I don't think Shinji, I don't know if he's necessarily, like, bisexual. I don't know if he's necessarily, like, attracted to Kaoru in the sense of finding him attractive because he's a beautiful boy. He finds him attractive because he's the only person who he can understand and connect with. And so it turns into this sort of, fascination with him and a desire to be closer. And then, of course, Kaoru, turns out to be an angel and all that. But that element of it connected with me so strongly that it was like, oh my god, I am Shinji. Then we get the last 2 episodes. Now, the last 2 episodes were like the greatest thing I'd ever seen in my life when I was that age. Like, it was totally just mind expanding, and it really, like, affected the way I thought about the world a lot and stuff. I remember I didn't even blink through most of the last episode. Like, I was so enraptured with it. And partly it's because of just the fact of it being so out there. Like, at the time, I hadn't heard anything about Eva having supposed budget issues. I hadn't heard anything about it, running out of time and them not being able to animate the last episodes. And I don't think I knew anything about the movie. Like, at no point from my perspective was this the show suddenly going downhill in animation quality. From my perspective, this was just art house. This was just it getting really trippy and mindfucky, and, we're at a time where I'm starting to get into that kind of stuff. So I was just totally blown away by it. I thought it was a genius artistic decision. And the concept that's presented in there of that the me that is in my mind is different from the me that's in your mind and stuff like that. The whole part where it's all the different versions of Asuka, and it's like, this is the Asuka in Shinji's mind. This is the Asuka that she sees herself as. That whole concept I'd never even thought about before, and it was so fucking mind-blowing to me. And I still refer to it all the time. You'll hear me refer, if you listen to a lot of podcasts that I do, I mean, this isn't something I've ever put focus on, but you may hear me describe, oh yeah, the Asuka in Shinji's mind kind of thing, when that kind of concept comes up, because that's just how I understand it. That's how I learned it. It was just such a big deal to me, and it was immediately my favorite anime. I got the DVD set for my birthday along with the movies and finally watched those, loved it. I say those because Death and Rebirth was it was like a 2-pack, but that's not really even a fucking, movie. So yeah, I was totally into Eva. But here's where we run into the issues, because again, I watched the whole show in one day. So most of it was kind of a blur. I mean, there were parts that I probably wasn't paying that much attention, parts that just got left by the wayside in my memories when I mostly remembered all the big important scenes and the ending. So I think about a year later, I tried to watch Eva again, and I was watching it, I think, subtitled this time, and I think I made it through 8 or 9 episodes and then just never got around to more. Then I tried again, and I think maybe I just continued from where I'd left off, and I got it to episode 16, but I couldn't remember what had been going on, and I was just kind of confused about the plot. There was a lot of stuff that I hadn't remembered, and I don't know, it was just the timing was never right or something, and so I never got around to finishing it. Then years go by, and the Rebuild movies start coming out, and so I remember I watched the first Rebuild probably not until around when the second one was coming out. And I remember thinking it was cool. I mean, it was just the first 6 episodes, which, is fine. It has better animation and the Romuel fight's really fucking cool in the movie, so that was cool. Then the second film came out, and I absolutely loved it. I really loved Rebuild 2.22, and I wrote a big long post about it on my blog in 2010. And I had kind of been hoping at the time that Rebuild would be a replacement Eva, that I wouldn't have to go rewatch the show because the movies would kind of capture the same sort of emotions without being the exact same story, that it would be a different version that would be more accessible and easier to come back to. Anno had said this piece before the Rebuild film started coming out. He wrote a thing kind of explaining the incentive to do it. And he was talking about how Eva is sort of a series about continually rising up again and again, always persevering, because even though you keep finding yourself with the floor falling out from under you again and again and again, if you want to keep going, you just gotta keep finding a way forward, sort of thing. And that the Rebuild films were sort of an attempt to just do that again. That we've hit a sad ending, but we got to pick ourselves up and we got to do it again. We just got to keep doing it again and keep going through the cycle. It felt like it was supposed to be a version of Eva that would reach the self-actualization that maybe Shinji didn't quite reach, or did so in such an esoteric way that most people didn't get it, Because, at the end of the show, he gets his congratulations scene. It's he figured out who he was, I guess, but the circumstances surrounding it are just totally bizarre and difficult to interpret. Same goes for the movie, so maybe this will just be a version that's a little bit more clear about what the story was maybe trying to say all along. Who knows? 3.33 came out. I didn't end up seeing it till years later. In fact, I just saw it this year. I hated it. I thought it was total fucking dog shit. It had nothing to do with Evangelion. The next time I tried to watch the show was in 2013, I think. Late 2013, I believe. My friend Idelia, who was a fanfic writer, had just watched the show a couple months prior and was really interested in it. So I decided to do a podcast with him. You can still find the first 2 episodes of this on Digibro After Dark, I think. They're either, I don't know if they're still listed, but they might be at the very bottom of all my listed videos. And basically the idea was we would watch 2 episodes of the show at a time and then record a podcast about it. Or maybe it was we recorded after each episode and then we had 2 episodes per podcast. That might have been the case. So yeah, the idea was we were going through, commenting on each episode and then posting it, and we recorded up through episode 10, maybe even 12, but we had only released the 2 podcasts covering episodes 1 through 4, and then my hard drive failed and I lost all the other recordings. So yeah, we stopped doing it after that. So finally, after years of being like, I want to talk about Eva, but at this point, it'd been so long since I've seen it, and there's so much about it I didn't understand because I hadn't rewatched the second half like almost at all since 2006. I'd seen the first half now like 5 times and never seen the second half. And there's so much supplementary material and so much other analysis on the internet that it felt like I am just not equipped to talk about Evangelion. Like, even if I rewatched it, I'm sure there's a lot I'm not going to get. And this was reinforced by looking at other people's uploads about it. Because I watched Demolition D's videos about the Eva TV series compared to the Rebuild movies. And there's this part where he shows how the shots of Misato at the dinner table with Shinji are direct parallels to the angel battle that he was in the night before. And I'd never known that, never seen that detail before. And I was like, whoa, this is like a totally new angle that I've never even seen, that I didn't even know was there. And then Goat Jesus had done this video about this little, one of the Studio Kara short films that was part of the Animator Expo, where they did this little Evangelion thing that was supposed to be like, I guess, a bridge between 3.0 and 4.0 or something. It was a confusing little 7-minute short that I had watched and just thought, this is just a bunch of concept art. This is pointless. Like, this is stupid. I don't care. And then he made a video analyzing it for like 8 minutes and just saying all this shit that like I had never even heard of. I was like, what is all this stuff? Like, what does all this have to do with Evangelion? So I started to get this idea in my head that like there's just so much to know about this show that I don't. And so that's why I had the idea for this podcast series where I was going to do a podcast about every episode of the show with a different guest each time. And I'd try to like go around the internet and find all these people who are deeply knowledgeable about Eva. So like, whoever leads the Eva Geeks forums, Demo, Goat Jesus, anybody who had a microphone that could talk to me about the show, Endless Jess. And then after I did all that and I compiled all the information I could possibly find about the show and watched it all again, I would write a book of analysis about it. And of course, this is one of those projects that is just so big, there's no way it can happen. Like, it quickly got so over the top that I would never, like, actually make plans for it and get it running. So yeah, I just kind of abandoned it. And then at some point, it just clicked in my mind that I was like, let's just fucking watch Evangelion and start talking about it. So I watched episode 1 and thought, okay, I could talk about this. And then I watched episode 2 and went, okay, there's something to say about this. And a lot of it is also informed by reading I'd done about Eva, back in my blogging days. Like, I mean, this show's been covered by so many people in so many ways. There is just so much to say about it. It's incredible. It's hard to even fathom the depths of this show. The fact that I could watch the show when I was 14 and only connect with Shinji and it still be my favorite show, and then watch it as an adult. And then now I finally understand Asuka, I finally understand Rei, I totally relate to Misato, I totally understand what Gendo was doing the whole time, like, and Kaji, like, all these characters who made no sense to me when I was a kid. Now I get all of it, It was such a enriching experience to see it all again. So a lot of people have asked me, why didn't I keep making videos about Eva? Why did I only cover up through episode 9? And the reality of it is that the second half of the show disappointed me when I rewatched it in 2015. And that's totally unfair. It only disappointed me because the stuff I was so excited about in the first half that I was discovering doesn't persist into the second half. And the stuff in the second half had all become passé to me over the last 10 years of thinking about it. Because again, as a kid, the stuff that really mattered to me was all the like psychological exploration and the philosophy and stuff, like these ideas about the world and how people connect, and like the idea of the collective consciousness, and all this crazy shit that gets explored in the last few episodes, which in the time since then, I spent years obsessing over those concepts. Like, as a teenager, I was just so into psychology and philosophy and all that kind of shit. And I watched lots of other shows that explored those things, like Serial Experiments Lain and Ghost in the Shell and all these other things that do the same kind of concepts, that by the time I watch it again in 2015, all those concepts seem passé to me. And all I really see is that the animation quality has taken a massive dive. That's the main thing I notice. Because my videos about the show, I was mainly focusing on some very technical writing and directing and stuff like that, aspects of it, that I felt like no one was really exploring. Because people like to talk about Eva in very broad psychological and philosophical terms. They like to talk about the way these characters think, or what their actions mean, or the symbolism and stuff like that. And I wanted to strip all that back and talk about just how strong the show is just in presentation, that the images have so much depth and meaning to them individually. You know, you look at episode 1 and there's all these shots that just convey so much in like a second that it's incredible. Or the ingenious way that episode 2 is structured so that you get the fight later into the episode when there's more context for it, as opposed to at the very beginning. And it creates this great little mystery that keeps you watching what would otherwise be a kind of slow and boring exposition part of the episode that, had it come after the fight scene, would have seemed totally lame. Or episodes 3 and 4 and this exploration of empathy between these two characters. Or something like how Asuka showing up in episodes 8 and 9 totally changes the show just by the nature of Asuka being in it. That when you introduce a new personality to a show, it inherently changes the dynamic of it. All of these really interesting production techniques and writing stuff. And then I get to episode 10, which is kind of a bit of a throwaway. I mean, it's a fun episode, but then you get to 11 and it's, and then you get to that recap episode with the second half that's like just recolored scenes from earlier in the show. And then the animation quality goes down and the pacing becomes a lot less tight, and you get these scenes that are sort of like weird and repetitive and like would have been shocking seeing them for the first time. Like when Asuka gets like mind raped, there's this scene where like it keeps replaying these 3 animation clips for like minutes on end as Asuka's just kind of like screaming and suffering and stuff. And like, had I not known that this was going to happen to Asuka, that would be like, oh my god, what is happening? This is madness, But watching it again, it's just like, man, we're really watching these 3 clips for minutes on end and just listening to like a, general suffering here. Like, man, this scene is going on for a while, is kind of the feeling I had. And so after rewatching the entire show, what I ended up focusing on the most, like the one thing from the second half of the show that I still really wanted to talk about, was the directing techniques that sort of pop up throughout the whole show, which is why I made the 10 cool directing tricks in Evangelion video. But other than that, I just felt like I had been let down by the second half of the show, so I didn't want to cover it, Again, with each previous video, I had just been watching an episode and having an idea, and then I watched the entire rest of the show and had no more ideas, so that's why there was no more video. This isn't to say that I will never cover it, because now that I kind of know what happens in the second half, which again, I had not seen in 10 fucking years, now I remember, and now I can go, okay, well now that I know what it is, I can look at it again, and then maybe I'll find more, maybe now that my memory's jogged, like, with those first 8 episodes, I think I was able to come to a lot of those conclusions because I spent a lot more time thinking about those episodes than the later ones. So, who knows? But that's why I stopped covering Eva. And I was so kind of let down at the time that I considered the show like a 9 out of 10, and I kind of kept it lower on my favorites list. But then I thought about it again and I was like, yeah, but there's just, like, even in that second half, even with the disappointing elements, there's still so much to think about. Like, this show has never left my mind for 10 years. This show has constantly been running through. So much of my understanding of the world relates back to these characters. How often do I, describe things through their similarity to Shinji or Asuka, or the relationship of Shinji and Asuka, or Misato? Like, how much of my thought process is dominated by this show? Obviously, it's a classic. Obviously, it's one of the greatest things ever made. Obviously, it's downright incredible, regardless of what faults it might have. Like, I can't let myself get bogged down in the fact that it's not all the tightest, most masterful directing and animation that there ever was. It's a show that has some blemishes, but those do not diminish the incredible heights that it reaches. So yeah, just thinking about it, my opinion kind of warmed back up to it a bit. I just couldn't let myself go thinking less of Eva or stewing in disappointment over it when there's so much to talk about and so much to think about. I suspect that we will never be done talking about Eva as a society. Like, we're 20 years out from the show's airing, and it still matters. It still feels as vibrant and new and original now as it did then. Like, you could watch this show any given season, and there's never been another show that did the same thing better. There's never been another show that imitated it without looking like a pale imitation. It was an absolute masterclass at sending its message, and I really can't name, like, another thing that tops it in terms of just pure depth. Like, in terms of just doing a lot of things and doing all of them well and, like, sending just a vast number of messages, I've never seen anything like it, save for stuff that's, like, literally hundreds of times longer, like a Homestuck or something. It's really unfortunate that I do think the third movie sucked balls. I don't even know if it's possible that the fourth rebuild could recover from it. Like, that third movie is a fucking dumpster fire, and you'll be able to hear me talk about it on The Plebe and the Weeb whenever that episode comes out, whenever Jesse's done editing the damn thing. But in a way, it's kind of nice to think that if the rebuilds turn out to be just a pile of shit that we don't have to think about, then we can just focus back on the original series and finding whatever's left to explore, because I do think that the rebuilds kind of sidetracked the Eva discourse a bit, though I also wouldn't mind just moving on to other stuff. Like, do I think that Eva has been talked about too much? No. But do I think that we need to never shut up about it forever? We can call it in at some point. Somewhere along the line, if we don't have anything new to say about it, maybe it's not worth constantly bringing up. But as long as I keep looking back and being surprised to find that there's an angle I haven't seen covered yet, such as what I did in all the videos I made about the show, then, I'll keep going with it. I think that about wraps up my thoughts on and personal history with the show. Again, I don't think I said as much here as I do in any of the actual videos I've made about it, but you can go watch those if you want to hear, like, my sort of stances on them. I just thought it would be interesting to talk about how I connected with this show so much and thought about it so much in spite of having seen it so few times, and, like, maybe clear the air for people who maybe perceive me as more of a huge Eva dork than I am. Much as I love the show, I've only seen it twice all the way through. Seen the movie more times, though. I think I've seen End of Eva 3 or 4 times, but whatever. There's going to be one more episode of this, one more final last goodbye to this podcast. I wanted Eva to be a dramatic climax, but we've got to go for the denouement in our 13th episode to round out this season. And that's going to be an odds and ends podcast. We're going to call it probably Growing Old. It's just going to be about a bunch of things that are along these lines that I didn't have enough to say about to make a whole podcast about them, but I can kind of put them all into one. So look forward to that, and I'll see you then.